Now, there's a lot of talk in the world about innovation, but how do we actually build it into our workplace, especially in corporate cultures where it's hard to make change? Good news for all of us is that we now have the founder and CEO of the Innovation Alliance and a global innovation speaker all the way from Amsterdam. Please welcome Chris Heemskerk. Enjoy, Chris.
Thank you. Hello, Istanbul. It's fantastic to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation, in special to Seda and, of course, my friend and fellow innovation leader, Dr. Hussein Güler. Without them, I would not be here, so thank you so much for the invitation. And so, hopefully everyone is up and ready to build a world-class innovation engine. So, just as a quick background, quick introduction, to show through what kind of lens I like to look at innovation. Before 2012, spent some time in Europe at Apple. Then between 2012 and 2016, spent some time at the European headquarters for Google in Dublin. Between 2016 and 2023, I was asked to oversee the acquisitions programs for Google in North America. And then since 2023, started my own company, which is called the Innovation Alliance, and it's a global network of tech executives and innovation leaders, and together we help organizations develop innovation capabilities. And so this love for innovation started back in 2018 when I was studying innovation at Harvard Business School, and I remember staying in touch with a key professor there. Her name is Linda Hill, and I told her, like, hey, we have this innovation lab in Google. It was called the Sales Acceleration and Innovation Labs. And I asked her, like, hey, would you like to come and document that in the form of a Harvard case study? And so we had to find a fit, of course. But 5 years later, we launched the case study together. And this case study concerns how does Google innovate in a commercial context? Because as you're familiar in business and in sales teams, you have a quarterly target. And so how do you innovate in a context where you have a sales target on your back? And so that is essentially the essence of the case study. And so I feature in the case as an advisor to the Innovation Lab. And that's how the journey started. And so I was still not satisfied because on Monday morning at 9 a.m., I wanted to have a comprehensive model of how to drive innovation across organizations. And so you'll see on the pictures more bedtime reading, more executive education, both at Harvard and at Stanford, more networking with fellow innovators across the globe. I did the same past October with Dr. Hussein Güler. And ultimately trying to get the best comprehensive model on how to drive innovation at scale in organizations. And the culmination of that is the Innovation Scorecard, which essentially looks at 4 key areas. So innovation culture. So how do you get people bought into innovation? So what are the raw ingredients you need for that? Then organizational design, right? It's not just culture, there's more to it. And then external dimensions. So how do we partner with partners, suppliers, and stakeholders to drive new efforts? And then finally, effectiveness. We have all the input, but ultimately innovation has to result in output. And so measuring that becomes a key area. And so we're talking about innovation today, and so I wouldn't do you justice without talking about the definition. So what do we mean by innovation? Because we have a jungle of buzzwords around there. And so we have disruption, design thinking, AI. We've heard it all today by some of the fantastic speakers we've already had the pleasure of listening to already. But I like to look at innovation through a couple of points, through a couple of axioms or dimensions. And so you have seen that innovation is probably not just about products or services that are new, but you've also seen new business models erupt and new processes in a company. So not just products and services. And so these can be breakthrough ideas, but they can also be smaller incremental improvements. And finally, I firmly believe that innovation should be profitable, it should be sustainable, but it should also be defensible, meaning that you're able to add some level of IP to your innovation. Because if it is not defensible, then others could copy it very quickly. And so the stress test that I like to use is that you've probably seen organizations that claim that they're innovating. For example, a company is saying, we're launching a new CRM system, right? A new customer relationship management system, and we're finally able to send proposals out quicker to the clients. And so we're innovating. But then the customer might be saying, well, you're just getting your act together. Or maybe a competitor is saying, well, actually, that's a hygiene effort or a hygiene factor. You should have already solved that 10 years ago. It's not really innovation. Just because a company internally is naming it and labeling it as innovation doesn't always mean that it is truly innovation. And so these are more of the performance gaps, meaning that all the things that would have been executed anyway. You could have had, let's say, a very competent manager or an MBA, they would have rolled this out anyway. And we're looking more towards, let's say, opportunity gaps, so the things that you could be doing, in the words of Linda Hill and her colleagues. And so I've already alluded to this, not just products and services, but also, in some cases, new business models. So, for example, we had Gillette not making money by the actual razor, but the razor blade model in the post-purchase behavior. And then also processes. So some of you might be familiar with Amazon and then, let's say, the one-click checkout. And so a customer might be saying, well, you know, I can check out quicker, it's not so interesting. But a competitor, they can look at it and see, well, hey, there's a lot of logistical complexity behind this checkout process. And so that makes it more defensible. And those are the opportunity gaps. So why do organizations, and why do some organizations manage to innovate time and again while others just get lucky? And one of the key findings from Linda's research, from Linda Hill's research, is that the main component is that they're able to cultivate leaders that function like social architects. And when I was part of this learning journey for myself, I thought like, well, it's probably Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos that have fantastic ideas, and they have this, you know, this culture thing going on. That's probably it, because I saw the same thing at Google at the time. But then, you know, culture dog kicks in and says, well, that's bogus, because culture is just 50% of the story. There's also something such as organizational design. So how is the organization set up to innovate? And then you think you are ready, but you're frankly not, because then we go right back to the leaders, to the CEO, and ask them, how are they spending their time? And what I mean by that is, you can imagine that there's organizations out there with leaders that are asking for innovation to happen, but the CEOs themselves are spending 99% of their time on the core business. And so we've seen that the most effective leaders for innovation and the most effective organizations, they have CEOs and senior leaders that spend between 20 and 40% of their time on innovation and new growth efforts. And that sends, as you can imagine, it sends a strong signal to the organization that this is important. And so you see the same happening with middle management, asking for the organization to innovate. Please innovate this year. And then, oh, just a small detail, by the way, 100% of your performance and 100% of your compensation is tied to the core business. And so you can already sense that that provides issues. And so the willing and able part was important. So again, according to Linda Hill's research, the organizations that are able to manage time and again, they were able to get their people willing and able to innovate and get their organization placed by social architects. They're able to orchestrate that at scale. And so with willing, we mean, why do we exist? What is our shared purpose? What are our shared values? What are some of the rules of engagement of how we work together? And as Luca De Meo said it, the former chief marketing officer of Volkswagen, he said that people are willing to face the personal challenges and complexities of innovation if they are part of a strong community. And then people need to be able to innovate. So with able, we mean, how do we cultivate a marketplace of ideas? How do we find a way to test those ideas? And how do we make decisions of which ideas we will work with and which ones we won't? And that's how organizations become an ambidextrous organization. So being able to exploit the current business that we have, and then at the same time, explore new growth avenues as we go. And you might have seen this with, for example, examples like Netflix, starting with DVDs in the mail, going into streaming, producing their own original content, and then, games, AI-generated content. So every time they are about to saturate the first curve of growth, they already have the next thing lined up. And we saw the same thing, you'll probably remember, with Apple, going from the iPod and the iMac to the iPhone and the iPad, the AirPods, and then, we had the credit card industry. And so, again, you see that same pattern of S-curves, of new products and services taking off, and then before the first S-curve is saturated, they already have a next thing lined up. And as part of the innovation engine, which we developed, is essentially what are the core 10 ingredients that highly innovative organizations have in place. And I'll go through this with you quite quickly, but essentially you have to start with getting the leadership buy-in. And what I mean by that is if the C-suite, if CEOs, if a CFO is not bought into the innovation efforts and you don't get the funding and support, it becomes very hard to drive it through the organization and to create the time and space for it. You have seen that organizations from the bottom of the organization, they have innovators, but if they're not able to get the room to innovate, it becomes very tough for them, very demoralizing when their projects don't get funded. Then you do an assessment of the current situation. So where are we today? What are some of the challenges that we're facing? So every good piece of strategy starts with a situation assessment of where you are and where you need to go. Then with regards to the innovation perspective, it's kind of like an innovation thesis from that perspective, is that you look at, okay, so what are some of the products and services that are doing well? Which ones are in decline? And what are some of our unique skills and unique resources and unique assets that we have as a company? And then once you have done that on the left side, only then you can look on the right side of the canvas and you start to look at, okay, so what kind of opportunities are ahead? What kind of emerging trends, technologies, what kind of new customer segments can we work on? But then there's, the beauty of making choices. You can imagine that, if you go through these exercises, you have a list of 200 options, and then it's a decision of making, what will you focus on in the next year, 3 and 5 years out, and maybe longer. And then equally importantly, where will you not invest? So what are some of the guardrails to the hunting ground? So this sends a very strong and very clear signal to the organization and people that work in innovation to tell them where they should also not focus, because it frees up their time and it saves a lot of opportunity cost. And slowly on, you start to develop your innovation portfolio. And the innovation portfolio is just a fancy word for organizing your innovation efforts that are happening in the company. So as you can imagine, you can look at, okay, well, what are some of the projects that we're doing? How far along are they? How do we actually rate how those projects are going? How do we assess them? Is it a good fit with the brand? Are we still on budget? Do we have something that is defensible, something that we can actually claim IP on? And then we look at, okay, so in what kind of innovation horizon is this? Is this something close to the core? Is it something adjacent, or is it something transformational? And what I mean by that is, if something is close to the core, it means that you're having existing products and services for existing target customers. Adjacencies would mean where you would develop new products and services for existing customer segments, or, for example, taking existing products and services for new customer segments. So that provides an adjacency to venture into. And the most difficult thing, as you would have probably noticed by now, is that the most difficult thing is the transformational work, where you develop entirely new products and services for a customer that you're not serving yet. And one example of this is Amazon Web Services, where they developed Amazon Web Services and cloud storage and cloud solutions for a new audience, because before that, they were catering to e-commerce customers. You get your innovation model in place, and the innovation model is essentially your innovation mix. So what are some of the innovation initiatives that we have running across the company? And as HR leaders, you need to know which innovation talent is situated where and who's leading it. And you slowly on start to develop a framework of how you measure these experiments. So Eric Ries coined this very well with the build, measure, and learn loop. So once we build something, we have to measure how this goes, and then we have to learn from our experiments. And so if you don't have a framework like this set up, it's very hard to compare apples to apples of what innovation opportunities to pursue and which ones to kill, frankly, because you'll have competing initiatives. Getting the stakeholders on board. How many times has it happened that an innovation project launched and then it launches in January, but then in November, legal comes and says, oh, I'm sorry, but we can't do this. And so the idea there is to make stakeholders such as legal your friends from the beginning and making them your allies. Another example is marketing. Marketing coming after 7 months. I'm sorry, but you have to stop this project because it's not a good fit with the brand. We're stuck. And finally, establishing KPIs, because innovation should be measurable. We should be able to measure the outcomes. And so what kind of KPIs are we looking for? For HR specifically, how shall we train our teams? Capabilities, so design thinking. We have innovation strategy. We have other innovation practitioners, for example, learning about design, innovative design. And so it's a part of training, a curriculum. There's budget needed for that. That all needs to be put in place. And then finally, in some cases, if the organization is larger, you have to have tools and systems in place to manage innovation at scale. So one example of this is normally organizations have an Excel sheet, but if you want to manage it at scale, some software is able to, collect all your innovation projects and see how far along it is, who's working on it, and then how people can participate on these innovation projects. So when we talk about innovation culture, you've probably heard many times the expression, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Maybe a show of hand, how many times you've heard this by Peter Drucker? So I see quite a lot of hands in the room. There's just a problem with this expression. First of all, the statement was never confirmed by Peter Drucker. He never really said it. And so I got this from Roger Martin the other day, a renowned professor on strategy, but Peter Drucker never said this. It's like, what? The whole LinkedIn has been saying this. And secondly, I have a problem with it, is because it suggests that culture and strategy are antagonists, that they compete with each other, right? It's like, no, it's strategy, no, it's culture. But I have a problem with that, because culture and strategy should be having breakfast together. One should not be eating the other, and I'll explain why. And imagine a situation where a CEO is saying, please, let's prioritize sustainability this year. We're going to have a culture of sustainability. We're going to print double-sided. But if that CEO says, we have 0 sustainability commitments in our corporate strategy, we're not spending time, money on it, and resources, our investors aren't complaining about it, then you can imagine that that CEO is going to have limited credibility. Hopefully this resonates a little bit, because we talked about culture and trying to ask for a culture to happen, but if the key leaders in the organizations don't take the strategic decisions to back that culture up, then it becomes very difficult to drive change in your organization. We've heard from Amal, we've heard from Matt earlier this morning, rightfully called out the components of psychological safety. And as Amy Edmondson spoke about this many times in her books, incredibly important to have people being okay to take risks and being able to admit mistakes to each other. And one project that we did in Google was called Project Aristotle, where they looked at the highest performing teams, and they all had one thing in common, is that the highest performing teams had the highest levels of psychological safety, where there was trust as part of the innovation process. So giving another +1 to what Amal said earlier today. And then secondly, what I love about Amy Emmons' work is that she talks about failure. We talk about failure all day. You have to innovate and fail fast, but we don't want every type of failure. We like to distinguish between basic failures, complex failures, and then intelligent failures. And in short, essentially what she means is that you have some basic failures, the failures that you could have prevented because you were not conscientious enough. Then there is the complex failures, which is probably like a perfect storm of things going wrong at the same time, and it's hard to pinpoint what went wrong and where. But then finally, there's a more interesting way of failing, which is intelligent failures, where these failures actually serve as a learning, as an experiment that the organization can learn from and build onto the next avenue. And so these are failures that are pursuing a new goal, that are in a new territory, so you're not discovering the same things over and over again. that it's driven by a good hypothesis and a thesis, and that you make the failure as small as possible. So if a pilot is learning how to fly, you're not going to do it 20,000 feet up into the air. And then the types of conflicts that you want. And Adam Grant was fantastic with this in his book, saying that as part of the innovation process, you don't want to have let's say, a relationship-based conflict where people sit beside each other or like across from each other at the table, pitching one idea and agreeing or disagreeing. What you want psychologically is to have people sit beside each other at the table, sitting next to each other and looking at the problem together. And that is a totally different mind shift, which I took from my time as a sales leader, instructing our salespeople is that when you're talking with a client, never sit right across from them at the table. Try to sit maybe a little bit beside them to be on their side, looking at the problem together. And that mind shift is what you need when working on innovation projects together. Who remembers, in Google we had a practice, it was called 20% time. Who remembers this? Maybe, that you could spend 20% of your time on innovation work. I see some people, they were familiar with this. And so we did this too. We spent 20% of our time on innovation. That was the idea. But the reality was, it was 120% time. And so we spent the evenings and weekends spending time on new innovation projects beyond their core role. And this was a running joke in the company. But this is all about taking the time and space to innovate. It was very difficult for us to do it. And so the new recommendations are that instead of 20% time, so let's say 1 day a week, have people that are working on innovation projects, have them work at least 2 days or 40% of time on innovation. And the reason why is because of two main things. The first one is that you can enforce it so that people can really block off their calendar for a day or two. And then secondly, you can give them target relief on the core business, on their core projects, so that they can really have the time and space to work on innovation projects. But then also from a management position, you can hold them accountable if, let's say, they're working on a project for 2 or 3 months and there's nothing there, then instead of, let's say, 20% time as an afterthought, you can now say, well, you've been working on this for 40% of your time. I am expecting at least some results or at least some levels of effort with how you engage with our customers and listening to them in order to drive new efforts. Another thing we had in Google was the Courageous Penguin Award. So, of course, you have awards for the projects that do very well, that generate a lot of value for customers, but we also had an award for teams that did a project but did not succeed yet, but they had this wonderful courage and there were many intelligent failures as part of that project. And then we would always have a prize for that. And the reason why it was called a Courageous Penguin Award is because when penguins migrate from iceberg to iceberg, you can imagine that none of the penguins want to jump, but there is one penguin that has to jump first. And so the question is, who is the courageous penguin in the room today? Maybe there are many of them today. In Amazon, we had multiple paths to yes. So for example, if somebody at the bottom of the organization had a beautiful idea, a fantastic idea, but for example, they had a manager that was leaving the company or a manager that did not have a good rapport with them, the idea would die. But Amazon had multiple areas in the organization where they could pitch their idea and get support for their idea. And so this comes from the venture capital industry where investors are looking for companies to invest in. And you can maybe remember that Airbnb, so Airbnb, the hospitality program or the platform, it took 10, 20, 30 investors that said no. However, we all know that today Airbnb is a multi-billion-dollar company. And so the question is not always, is the idea the problem, or is it maybe the eye of the beholder and the person who is assessing the innovation? Another thing Amazon had was a future press release. So in order for people to share their innovation ideas, instead of just saying it randomly during a meeting, they had people think through it and write a fictional press release as if it already happened. And that forces them to really think it through. Another thing Amazon had was the empty chair. So whenever an important decision was being made and the customer was involved, then they would leave an empty chair in the room, symbolizing the customer sitting there. So to always do right by the customer. A short graph here. what does she need, this lady? This girl? Maybe an idea? What does she need? A ladder? Any other ideas? Chair? Yeah. So a lot of us, right, we are jumping to conclusions quickly, which is great because we like to solve problems. But essentially what she needs is knowledge, right? She's looking for knowledge. And so the idea here is that we like to look at the things that we want to provide the solution for directly, but we have to sometimes provide or remove the urge to give solutions right off the bat. But first looking at the problem first. And so that is one of the recommendations if you want to have your teams innovate, is to first focus on the problem and really falling in love with the problem first. And knowing if you're right and knowing if you're on the right track, echoing what Amal said earlier today and also what Matt said earlier today, is that you have to be experimenting. You have to prototype your new innovations, your new products, your new services. Make a minimum viable product, make it a low fidelity prototype, show it to customers and get feedback and iterate on it. And this is what Zappos did, a very big shoe retailer in the States. Instead of buying all the shoes, they first just made a website, and then they saw all the customers that were coming to the website, and then they collected data. And then, when the order happened, he would buy the shoes from a shoe store, and he would not make any money on it, but after 6 months, he had such an amazing amount of data that he could leverage to buy his full inventory. Even Dropbox did not make the whole digital suite. Dropbox just basically made a video, a mock-up, and got investors to buy in for it that way because people wanted it. And so, as we close off, I would like to ask you, what is your biggest cost? And you might think, well, biggest cost is personnel on the payroll, it is maybe taxes. We have big costs in the organization, but the biggest cost is truly the things that we don't know. The biggest cost is the things that we could be doing and the opportunity cost that we have of not doing the right things. And so an example of this is that, let's say Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or maybe another tycoon, let's say they are broke tomorrow, or maybe Warren Buffett, let's say they're broke tomorrow, they have no more resources. You are sure that after maybe a year or two, they are probably a millionaire again. And why is that? Not because they had the money and connections, because we excluded those. It's because they have the operating model in their hand, the operating model in their head of how to find value and capture value. And so as you can imagine, every month that you don't know how to make $1 billion, that month costs you $1 billion. That's how crazy it sometimes is. So closing off, in the words of Mark Randolph, the founder of Netflix, he said it quite beautifully on LinkedIn recently, is that the main thing he has seen in 40 years of entrepreneurship is that nobody knows anything. Your family, your friends, your colleagues, your sister, your spouse, nobody knows anything. Nobody knows if your idea is good or bad. But you have to test your idea and collide it with reality, because that is the only way to learn. So as HR leaders, make sure that your organization gets their hands dirty, gets out of the building, talking to customers with their experiments. And so I have a wish for you as we close off, that your story will be, we don't know when the storm may come. We don't know when disruption will happen. But we have our bets lined up. And that's made possible by a disciplined and consistent innovation culture, like a well-oiled machine. And that's just another thing off my mind as a leader, and it's the highest level of control that I can have. I may have 99 problems, but innovation isn't one. So bring on the storm. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. That was
very much.
fantastic. Thank you. I'll take this from you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.